January 9th. 1943. Dawn broke over Stalingrad in shades of gray and white. The sun a pale disk behind storm clouds that still churned overhead. Gefreiter Klaus Weber sat in the basement of what had once been an apartment building on Krasnaya Street, his back against frozen brick, counting corpses. His hands were black with frostbite, fingers swollen to twice their normal size, but he forced them to move, pointing at each body as he tallied the night's harvest. 33 dead, 15 alive, though several of those would likely be corpses by nightfall. 48 men had crowded into this space when darkness fell the previous evening. The mathematics of survival were brutal and exact. The bodies sat frozen in the positions death had found them. Some slumped against walls, heads tilted at angles that would have been painful if they still felt anything. Others leaned on one another, creating tableaus of false companionship. 3 men remained upright as if merely sleeping, their spines locked rigid by temperatures that had dropped to 42 degrees below zero. Weber recognized most of them. Unteroffizier Dietrich, who had spoken endlessly about his bakery in Hamburg. Gefreiter Vogel, who had saved Weber's life during a Soviet counterattack in October. Young Schaefer, barely 18, who had cried for his mother as hypothermia confused his dying brain. Weber tried to stand, but his legs refused the command. Below his knees, he felt nothing. His feet existed somewhere at the end of his body, but they might as well have belonged to someone else. He knew what this meant. He had watched frostbite claim fingers and toes and entire limbs over the past weeks, had seen the black tissue that signaled dead flesh, had heard the screams in field hospitals as surgeons sawed through frozen bone. A sergeant moved through the basement, checking each man for signs of life, shaking the ones who might still wake. When he reached Weber and found breath still moving through damaged lungs, he grabbed Weber's shoulder and shook hard. The world swam back into focus. Weber managed to nod, unable to speak because his jaw had frozen shut during the night and his tongue felt too large for his mouth. The sergeant moved on, checking the next man. The next, working his way through the living and the dead with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed this duty too many times. Outside, wind still howled across the ruins of Stalingrad, though with less fury than the night before. The temperature remained lethal. Somewhere in this frozen hell, thousands of other basements held similar scenes. Thousands of German soldiers who had survived the worst night of the worst winter of the worst siege in military history were waking to count their dead and wonder why they had been spared. But the trap had been closing for months. They just hadn't known it yet. September 14th, 1942. Weber's company had entered Stalingrad on a day when summer still clung to the Volga region. When temperatures reached 20 degrees Celsius and the sky stretched blue and clear from horizon to horizon. The journey from their staging area had taken 2 days, columns of trucks and half-tracks rolling east through steppe country that reminded Weber of photographs he had seen of America's Great Plains, flat land extending forever, punctuated by occasional villages that Soviet forces had burned before retreating. The men sang as they rode, songs from home mixed with cruder verses about what they would do to Stalin when they captured his city. Lieutenant Martin Schneider sat beside Weber in the back of a truck, pointing out landmarks as if they were tourists rather than invaders. Schneider was 28, 3 years younger than Weber, with the kind of face that belonged in a university lecture hall rather than in a war zone. Before the war, he had taught literature at a gymnasium in Bremen. He carried a worn copy of Goethe's poems in his pack and quoted verses at odd moments, usually when the situation seemed least appropriate for poetry. His wife, Anna, was 6 months pregnant with their first child, a fact he mentioned approximately 50 times per day. Weber had known Schneider since their training together in 1940. They had survived France together, survived the early months of the Russian campaign together, survived 100 small battles and skirmishes that had killed men all around them while leaving them untouched. Soldiers developed superstitions about such things. Some men believed they were blessed, protected by God or fate or simple luck. Weber had no such illusions. He understood that survival was mostly random, that bullets and shells killed without regard for virtue or vice, that today's survivor could be tomorrow's corpse. But he appreciated Schneider's optimism even when he could not share it. The city appeared on the horizon as the sun reached its apex. Stalingrad stretched for nearly 40 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga River, a sprawling industrial center that produced tractors and tanks and artillery pieces in massive factories. Smoke already rose from multiple locations where German bombers had struck in previous days. The Luftwaffe had been pounding the city for weeks, turning residential blocks into rubble, killing thousands of civilians who had not evacuated when they had the chance. Soviet policy forbade evacuation. Stalin had issued orders that the city bearing his name must be held regardless of cost. Civilians would stay and work in the factories until Soviet soldiers could no longer defend them. Weber's company belonged to the 389th Infantry Division, part of the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus. Their orders were straightforward: advance into the city, eliminate Soviet resistance, secure the western bank of the Volga. Intelligence reports suggested that Soviet forces in Stalingrad numbered perhaps 60,000 troops, many of them poorly trained militia and factory workers, given rifles with minimal instruction. German forces committed to the assault numbered over 300,000. Victory seemed certain. The campaign was supposed to last weeks at most. The first day taught different lessons. Urban combat bore no resemblance to fighting in open country. Buildings became fortresses. Every window could hide a sniper. Every basement could hold a machine gun nest. Soviet forces had fortified the city with obsessive thoroughness, turning apartment blocks into strong points connected by trenches and tunnels. They contested every street, every building, every room. German forces advanced meter by meter, paying in blood for ground that seemed to have no strategic value. Weber's company lost 6 men the first day taking a single apartment building. They found 12 dead Soviet soldiers inside when the fighting ended. Schneider had stared at the bodies, at the debris of domestic life scattered among the corpses. A child's doll lay near one dead Russian, its painted face smiling up at the ceiling. Schneider picked up the doll and set it carefully on a shelf, as if this small gesture of order could restore some humanity to the chaos. Weber had understood the impulse, but also understood its futility. They were destroying the city to capture it, killing its defenders to claim its ruins. The strategic objective was the Volga River, the supply line that fed Soviet forces further south. But the battle had become something else, something that transcended military logic. Hitler wanted Stalingrad because it bore Stalin's name. Stalin would defend it for the same reason. Symbolism would kill thousands. The days became weeks. September gave way to October, and German forces ground forward through the rubble. Weber's company fought for a tractor factory, for a grain silo, for a railway station, for buildings that no longer had names because their identifying features had been blown away. They learned to move through ruins without silhouetting themselves against the sky, to clear rooms with grenades and close-range fire, to sleep in cellars while Soviet artillery pounded the floors above. The casualty rate was appalling. Of the 180 men in Weber's company who had entered Stalingrad in September, fewer than 100 remained alive by early November. But they were winning. By November 11th, German forces controlled approximately 90% of Stalingrad. Soviet defenders clung to a narrow strip along the Volga's edge, compressed into pockets that seemed ripe for final elimination. Schneider's optimism, which had wavered during the brutal October fighting, resurged. He showed Weber a letter from Anna. She was doing well. The baby was due in March. Schneider intended to request leave when the city finally fell, to be home for the birth. He talked about names, about whether a boy or girl would be preferable, about the apartment in Bremen where they would raise their child in a world finally at peace. Weber listened and said nothing about his own doubts. He had a wife too, Maria, and a daughter, Greta, who had turned 7 that summer. He had not seen them in 14 months. Letters from home arrived irregularly, always weeks or months out of date, describing a life that seemed to exist in a different universe from the one he inhabited. Maria wrote about food rationing, about Greta's progress in school, about neighbors whose sons had been killed in North Africa or Russia. Her letters maintained a careful optimism that Weber recognized as performance, a brave face maintained for his benefit. He wrote back with similar false cheer, describing the Russian countryside as if he were on vacation, never mentioning the fighting or the dying or the mounting certainty that this war would not end well. November 9th, 9:42. Weber woke to the sound of artillery fire, which was nothing unusual. Soviet forces shelled German positions every morning with mechanical regularity. But this artillery fire came from the wrong direction. Instead of incoming fire from the east, where Soviet forces held their last positions along the Volga, the shells were falling from the north and south. Weber pulled on his boots and climbed from the basement where his squad had slept, emerging into a gray dawn to find Schneider already outside, staring toward the northern horizon. The sky flickered with muzzle flashes. Kilometers away, perhaps 10 or 15, a massive artillery barrage was underway. The sound rolled across the frozen steppe like continuous thunder. Weber had heard bombardments before, but nothing on this scale. This was not harassing fire. This was a major offensive. Schneider's face had gone pale. He understood what Weber was beginning to understand. Soviet forces were not supposed to have the strength for major offensives. Soviet forces were supposed to be on the verge of collapse, defending desperately against final German assaults, Reports filtered back through the morning as German forces tried to assess what was happening. Soviet armor had struck Romanian positions north of Stalingrad, breaking through the defensive lines held by Germany's less capable allies. Another Soviet offensive had launched south of the city, hitting Italian and Romanian units with overwhelming force. The reports grew worse hour by hour. Romanian divisions were in full retreat. German forces rushed to plug the gaps were arriving too late, finding Soviet tanks already behind them. By afternoon, the shape of the disaster became clear. Soviet forces had launched a massive pincer movement, striking simultaneously north and south of Stalingrad, exploiting the weakness of Axis forces holding the flanks while German strength was concentrated inside the city. Oberst Wilhelm Krauss gathered the officers and senior NCOs of his battalion that evening. Krauss was 45 years old, a career officer who had fought in the previous war and had survived 2 decades of peacetime military service through a combination of competence and political neutrality. He had a face made of sharp angles, all cheekbones and jaw, eyes that revealed nothing. He had commanded the battalion since its formation and had lost more than half his men getting to this point. Now he stood in a basement lit by a single candle and explained their new reality with the clinical precision of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. Soviet forces had broken through north and south. German forces in those sectors were in disarray. The Sixth Army's supply lines ran west through the gap between the Soviet pincers, and that gap was closing fast. If the Soviets completed their encirclement, the entire Sixth Army would be trapped in Stalingrad. General Paulus had requested permission to conduct an immediate breakout, to abandon Stalingrad and withdraw west before the trap closed. Hitler had refused. The Führer's orders were explicit. Hold Stalingrad, maintain all positions, await relief from German forces outside the pocket. Krauss's voice remained steady as he conveyed these orders. But Weber saw something flicker in the Oberst's eyes. Doubt, fear, recognition that the decision coming from the highest levels of command was insane. But Krauss was a professional soldier, trained to obey orders even when those orders defied military logic. He dismissed the meeting without comment, without offering false hope, without pretending that their situation was anything other than catastrophic. Schneider found Weber afterwards, in the ruins above the basement, both of them staring west toward where Soviet forces were completing their encirclement. Schneider's optimism had finally shattered. His hands shook as he pulled Anna's latest letter from his pocket, reading passages aloud in the darkness. She was well. The baby was active, kicking hard enough to wake her at night. She missed him. She counted days until he would come home. Schneider's voice cracked. When would he go home now? How could he see his child when Soviet armies surrounded them on all sides? Weber had no answer. He thought about Maria and Greta, about whether they knew yet that the Sixth Army was trapped, about whether they believed the propaganda that Shirley would claim this was all part of some grand strategic plan. He thought about mathematics. 300,000 German soldiers in Stalingrad. The city consumed hundreds of tons of supplies daily. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. All of it flowing through supply lines that were about to be cut. November 23rd. The Soviet pincers closed. Radio reports confirmed what everyone already knew. The Sixth Army was encircled, trapped in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. Soviet forces held the ring. German forces held the interior. The nearest German units outside the pocket were already attempting to break through Soviet lines from the west, but their progress was slow and costly. Inside the pocket, rations were cut for the first time. Not drastically. Not yet. Just a small reduction, barely noticeable. A warning of things to come. Hermann Göring's voice came over the radio 3 days later. Broadcast to the troops with the Führer's authorization, the Reichsmarschall, commander of the Luftwaffe, spoke with absolute confidence about his Air Force's capabilities. The surrounded Sixth Army would be supplied entirely by air until ground forces broke the encirclement. Transport aircraft would deliver 500 tons of supplies daily, everything the Army needed to maintain combat effectiveness. Soldiers should have faith in the Luftwaffe, faith in German technology, faith in ultimate victory. Schneider wanted to believe. Weber watched his friend's face as Göring's promises echoed through the basement, saw hope kindle where despair had been growing. Perhaps it was possible. Perhaps the Luftwaffe could accomplish what seemed impossible. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Krauss said nothing about Göring's speech, but Weber noticed the Oberst consulting with his logistics officer, doing calculations on scraps of paper, 500 tons daily. What did that actually mean? How many aircraft? How many flights? What about losses to Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire? What about weather? The logistics officer shook his head, numbers not adding up to anything sustainable. Kraus stuffed the papers in his pocket and ordered his battalion to prepare defensive positions. They would hold their sector of the pocket. They would trust that someone above them knew what they were doing. The first supply flights arrived within days. Transport Ju-52 aircraft lumbered over the pocket, dropping supplies by parachute or landing at the airfield at Potomnik inside the encirclement. The quantities were immediately inadequate. Instead of 500 tons, perhaps 100 tons arrived on good days. Many days, weather prevented flying altogether. Soviet fighters prowled the skies, shooting down slow transport aircraft with methodical efficiency. Anti-aircraft fire claimed more. Crashes on landing or takeoff destroyed precious cargo and irreplaceable planes. The Luftwaffe was losing transport aircraft faster than they could be replaced. Rations were cut again in early December, then cut again. By mid-December, soldiers were receiving perhaps 800 calories per day, less than half what a man needed for basic survival, even without considering the additional energy required for combat operations and for staying warm as temperatures dropped. Hunger became a constant companion, a gnawing emptiness that never ceased, that dominated thoughts and dreams. Men talked endlessly about food, about meals they remembered eating, about recipes their mothers had cooked, about restaurants they had visited before the war. Weber had never been a large man, but he began to feel his body consuming itself. His uniform hung looser. His face became gaunt, cheekbones prominent, eyes sunken. Everyone was shrinking, flesh melting away as starvation did its work. The horses that had pulled artillery and supply wagons were slaughtered and eaten, their meat distributed as precious supplements to the meager rations. Then the horses were gone, and men began hunting rats in the ruins. Rats were plentiful in Stalingrad, feeding on corpses and garbage. They could be caught with improvised traps, killed with rocks or bayonets, cooked over small fires if fuel could be found. The meat was stringy and foul-tasting, but it was protein. Dr. Ernst Hoffmann arrived at Weber's position in mid-December, transferred from a field hospital that had been overrun by Soviet forces. Hoffmann was 38 years old, a surgeon who had served in the previous war and had returned to practice in civilian life before being recalled when this war began. He had kind eyes set in a face lined by years of witnessing suffering. He carried his medical bag everywhere, though its contents had been reduced to bandages torn from clothing and a few surgical instruments he had managed to preserve. He had no morphine, no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no plasma for transfusions. He could set bones and stitch wounds and amputate limbs, but he could do little else. Hoffmann examined the men in Weber's company, cataloging the progression of malnutrition, muscle wasting, vitamin deficiencies, immune system collapse. He explained to Kraus that starvation was not merely uncomfortable. It was deadly. A starving body could not maintain its core temperature. A starving body could not fight infections. A starving body could not heal from wounds that would have been minor under normal circumstances. The soldiers in the pocket were becoming progressively weaker, progressively more vulnerable, progressively closer to systemic collapse. Kraus asked Hoffmann how long the men could survive on current rations. The doctor calculated based on average body weight and caloric intake, perhaps 6 weeks before widespread deaths from starvation alone. Less if combat operations continued to burn calories. Less if disease outbreaks occurred. Less if temperatures dropped and bodies needed more energy to generate heat. The Oberst forwarded these medical assessments up the chain of command. No response came back. German forces outside the pocket had attempted to break through Soviet lines in late December, an operation called Wintergewitter, Winter Storm. The relief attempt advanced to within 40 kilometers of the pocket's edge before Soviet forces stopped it and drove it back. General Paulus requested permission to break out and link up with the relief force. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad. Relief would come eventually. The airlift would sustain them. Christmas arrived. Schneider had written letters to Anna throughout December. Letters that could not be mailed because the airlift was not carrying mail. Only desperately needed supplies that still fell short of requirements. He read portions aloud to Weber on Christmas Eve. He had described Stalingrad as if it were a noble endeavor, had spoken of courage and sacrifice and duty. He had not mentioned the rats they ate or the men dying from hunger or the cold that was beginning to claim lives with increasing frequency. He wanted Anna to receive news of his death. If it came without knowing how terrible his final months had been, Weber understood. He had written similar lies to Maria. War turned everyone into performers, maintaining fictions for loved ones who could do nothing to help and who deserved protection from the worst truths. Christmas Day brought no supply flights. A storm system had moved across the region, grounding aircraft. Men huddled in their positions and sang carols, Catholic and Protestant hymns mixing together in the ruins. Silent night. O Tannenbaum, songs about peace and home and joy. The singing sounded like ghosts, voices thin and weak from starvation and cold. Some men cried as they sang. Some sat silent, staring at nothing. The contrast between the song's messages and their current reality was too sharp to bear. Kraus distributed what extra rations he had managed to hoard, the few grams of chocolate per man, saved from earlier supply drops. It was a pathetic gesture and everyone knew it. But the men accepted the chocolate with something approaching reverence. Weber let his portion melt slowly in his mouth, making it last, remembering Christmases before the war when Greta had opened presents and Maria had cooked a goose and the world had seemed fundamentally safe. Hoffman spent Christmas treating frostbite cases. The cold had been building since November, temperatures dropping steadily as winter deepened. Early cases were minor, fingertips and toes turning white and numb, damage that would heal if treated promptly. But treatment required warmth, required circulation to be restored before tissue died. There was no warmth in Stalingrad. Men with frostbitten fingers could not hold their weapons. Men with frostbitten feet could not walk. The damage progressed from superficial to severe, from white numb skin to black dead tissue. Hoffman performed his first amputation on December 27th, sawing through a soldier's frozen foot with a surgical saw while 4 men held the patient down. There was no anesthesia. The soldier screamed until he passed out. Hoffman worked quickly, cutting through dead tissue, tying off blood vessels, wrapping the stump in bandages torn from a shirt. The soldier survived the operation but died 2 days later when infection spread from the wound. Antibiotics might have saved him. There were no antibiotics. Weber witnessed something in late December that he would never speak about to anyone. Not to Schneider. Not to Maria in letters. Not in the years after the war when survivors began to share their testimonies. He was searching for firewood in the ruins of a building when he heard voices in a basement. Descending the stairs, he found 3 soldiers from another company crouched around a fire made from broken furniture. They were cooking something in a pot, something that smelled almost like meat. One of the soldiers looked up as Weber entered, eyes feral with hunger and desperation. Weber saw what was in the pot before anyone spoke. A human arm, pale flesh visible where it had been hacked away from a body. The body itself lay in the corner of the basement, a dead German soldier. His uniform removed, his limbs partially butchered. The soldier stared at Weber. Weber stared back. No one spoke. After a long moment, Weber turned and climbed back up the stairs, back into the frozen ruins above. He said nothing to anyone. He understood that hunger had driven men to this final degradation, understood that he might face the same choice eventually, understood that judgment was a luxury that starving men could not afford. But the image stayed with him. The pale flesh in the pot, the desperate eyes of men who had crossed a line from which there was no return. January brought cold, unlike anything Weber had experienced. He had survived the winter of 1941-42, which had been severe enough to freeze unprepared German forces and contribute to the failure to capture Moscow. But that winter seemed mild compared to this. Temperatures dropped to -20, -30, -40 degrees Celsius. Wind chill made the actual temperature irrelevant, creating conditions where exposed flesh froze in minutes. German soldiers had not been issued adequate winter clothing because Hitler and the High Command had expected the Soviet Union to collapse before winter. The uniforms they wore were designed for temperate European climates, providing minimal insulation against Russian cold. Men improvised desperately. They stuffed newspapers inside their jackets, creating crude insulation layers. They wrapped themselves in blankets scavenged from ruins. They stole coats from Soviet corpses, wearing enemy uniforms over their own in layered defenses against the cold. Nothing was sufficient. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties by early January. Hoffman's field hospital was overwhelmed with cases. Soldiers arrived with hands frozen solid, feet frozen black, faces with patches of dead white tissue. The doctor triaged ruthlessly. Superficial frostbite was ignored. Men sent back to their units with advice to keep the affected areas warm if possible. Severe frostbite required amputation before gangrene killed the patient. Hoffman was amputating multiple limbs per day, working in a basement without heat, sawing through frozen flesh and bone, doing his best to save lives with inadequate tools and no supplies. He told Weber in early January that he had amputated over 60 limbs in 3 weeks. Perhaps 40% of those patients had survived. The rest had died from infection or shock, or simply from the accumulated damage that starvation and cold had inflicted on bodies with no reserves left to fight. Hoffman's hands were steady as he spoke. But Weber saw the exhaustion in the doctor's eyes, saw the toll that this work was taking on a man who had dedicated his life to healing. Soviet forces were tightening the noose. The pocket was shrinking as attacks eliminated German positions on the perimeter. The airfield at Potomac was abandoned under Soviet pressure, forcing supply flights to use the smaller field at Gumrak, which was closer to Soviet artillery. Fewer flights could land. More supplies were dropped by parachute, scattering across the pocket, often landing in no man's land where neither side could retrieve them. The tonnage delivered continued to decline. Some days, nothing arrived. The men were starving and freezing and dying, and no help was coming. Captain Dmitry Volkov watched the German pocket through binoculars from a position on the Soviet lines. Volkov was 32 years old, an intelligence officer who had survived the brutal early months of the German invasion and had learned to hate with professional clarity. His village had been burned by advancing German forces in the summer of 1941. His parents and younger sister had been among the civilians killed. He had no sympathy for the Germans freezing and starving inside the pocket. They had brought this suffering upon themselves through their invasion, through their war of extermination against the Soviet people. But Volkov was also a soldier with professional standards. He observed the German pocket with tactical interest. Monitoring the progression of their collapse, his reports to higher command detailed the evidence of starvation and frostbite visible through binoculars, German soldiers moving slowly, conserving energy, defensive positions inadequately maintained, fewer patrols, increased burial details, bodies being dragged out of positions and stacked like cordwood because the ground was too frozen to dig graves. Volkov's assessment was clinical. German combat effectiveness was deteriorating rapidly. Weather was accomplishing what Soviet attacks had struggled to achieve. Winter was killing thousands of Germans without Soviet forces needing to advance. The strategy was obvious. Maintain the encirclement, allow cold and hunger to weaken German resistance, then attack when they were too broken to fight effectively. Soviet casualties would be minimized. German casualties would be maximized. It was efficient warfare. But watching men freeze to death, even enemy men, even invaders who deserved their fate, created complications in Volkov's mind. He had interrogated German prisoners, had heard their stories of being abandoned by their leadership, of Hitler's refusal to allow retreat, of Göring's false promises about supply. The Germans in the pocket were victims of their own commanders' decisions as much as they were enemies to be destroyed. Both things could be true simultaneously. January 8th began like any frozen day. Weber woke in a basement on the northern edge of what remained of the German pocket. His company had been reduced to fewer than 50 men from the 180 who had entered Stalingrad in September. Most losses had come from combat, but the cold was claiming more men each week. Weber's hands were black with frostbite, fingers swollen and painful. His feet were numb, had been numb for days. He suspected the tissue was already dead, but could not bring himself to seek Hoffman's assessments. Diagnosis would lead to amputation, and amputation would make survival even less likely. At 4 p.m, Soviet artillery struck their position. Shells crashed into the building Weber's company had been defending, collapsing walls and ceilings, forcing a retreat to the basement below. 48 men crowded into a space designed for perhaps 20. They pressed together, trying to share body heat, trying to find positions that would allow them to survive the coming night. Schneider sat beside Weber, his face gone, eyes hollowed by months of insufficient food. He had not spoken much in recent days, conserving energy, retreating into himself. But now he pulled Weber close and spoke quietly. Words meant for Weber alone. If I don't survive, tell Anna I loved her. Tell our child about me. Tell them I tried to come home. Weber wanted to protest, to offer reassurance, to maintain the fiction that they would both survive. But lies seemed pointless now. He nodded. He would tell them, if he survived and Schneider did not. He would make sure Anna knew. The temperature was already minus 35 Celsius at 4 p.m. And the radio operator brought news that made Krauss's face go gray. A massive storm system was approaching from the north. Weather forecasters predicted temperatures would drop to minus 42 or lower by midnight. High winds would create wind chill approaching minus 50. No supply flights would be possible for at least 48 hours. Krauss looked around the basement at his 48 men. Most were wounded or sick. All were malnourished. None had adequate clothing for the temperatures that were coming. The Oberst's voice was steady as he addressed them, but Weber heard the resignation beneath the words. Some of us won't make it through this night. Stay together. Share warmth. Stay awake if possible. If you fall asleep in these temperatures, you may not wake up. Weber understood what Krauss was not saying. Many of them would die this night. Perhaps most of them. The cold that was coming was beyond human endurance. especially for bodies already weakened by starvation and months of exposure. The basement offered shelter from wind, but no heat. There was no fuel for fires. The boards they had burned in previous weeks were long gone. They would huddle together and hope their combined body heat would be enough, knowing it would not be enough, knowing that morning would bring account of the dead. The wind began rising as darkness fell, howling across the ruins of Stalingrad, driving snow horizontally through gaps in walls, finding every opening in their inadequate shelter. The temperature dropped minute by minute, breath turning to ice crystals in the air, frost forming on every surface. Men pulled closer together, forming a mass of shivering bodies. Some talked, trying to stay alert. Some prayed. Some had already retreated into silence, too exhausted to care whether they survived. Weber thought about Maria and Greta, about home, about warmth, about all the things he would never experience again. The cold was absolute, overwhelming, inescapable. It pressed in from all sides, leaching heat from bodies that had no heat left to give. His thoughts began to fragment, consciousness wavering. The world narrowing to just the cold and the darkness and the certain knowledge that he was going to die in this basement in this frozen city, thousands of kilometers from home. Schneider's hand found his in the darkness, gripped tight despite the pain from frostbitten fingers. They sat pressed together as the coldest night descended, two friends waiting for death in the ruins of Stalingrad, part of an army that had been abandoned by the leadership that had sent them here. The wind howled outside. The temperature dropped below -40, and the long night began 7 in the evening. The basement had become a single organism of shivering flesh. 48 men compressed into a space where breath frosted the air white and dissipated slowly in the absence of warmth. Weber could no longer distinguish individual bodies in the darkness. They had merged into a collective struggle against cold that had dropped to -41 degrees Celsius, according to the last thermometer reading before the instrument's mercury froze solid. Outside, wind velocity had increased to the point where the howling obscured all other sound. Snow forced its way through cracks in the ceiling, accumulating in corners, adding moisture that would freeze on skin and clothing and accelerate heat loss. Schneider sat to Weber's right, pressed so close their shoulders touched through layers of inadequate fabric. On Weber's left, a young soldier named Hans Kessler had begun crying quietly, tears freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. Kessler was 17 years old, conscripted 6 months earlier from a farm in Bavaria, barely trained before being shipped east. He had survived this long through a combination of luck and the protection of older soldiers who had taken responsibility for keeping him alive. Now he wept for his mother, for warmth, for home, for anything other than this frozen darkness. Kraus moved through the packed bodies, checking on men, offering what encouragement he could manufacture from a situation that offered none. The Oberst's face had taken on a skeletal quality, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes sunken deep in their sockets. Months of starvation had reduced him from a robust commander to a barely animate framework, but his voice remained steady, addressing men by name, reminding them to keep moving fingers and toes to maintain circulation, warning them to stay awake because sleep in these temperatures meant death. Weber flexed his hands, forcing blackened fingers to curl and straighten despite pain that shot up his arms. The frostbite had progressed beyond superficial damage. He could see tissue that had turned completely black, dead flesh that would need to be cut away if he survived long enough for amputation. His feet existed somewhere below his knees as abstract concepts rather than functioning body parts. He could not feel them, could not move his toes. The cold had severed neural connections, leaving him attached to dead weight that would kill him if gangrene set in. 8 o'clock. The shivering had intensified across the basement, men's bodies burning through their last reserves of energy in futile attempts to generate heat. Muscle tremors were the body's defense against hypothermia, contracting rapidly to produce warmth through friction. But shivering required calories, and calories required food, and food had been inadequate for weeks. Bodies were cannibalizing themselves, breaking down muscle tissue to fuel the shivering that was supposed to preserve life. The mathematics were inexorable. Starvation plus cold equaled death. Just a question of timing. Hoffman had positioned himself near the center of the mass of men, his medical training making him acutely aware of what was happening to bodies around him. He spoke to Kraus in a voice pitched low. Clinical assessment delivered with the detachment of a scientist observing an experiment. Hypothermia progresses in stages. Mild hypothermia at 35 degrees Celsius core temperature. Shivering. Confusion. Impaired judgment. Moderate at 32 degrees. Shivering stops. Muscles become rigid. Consciousness fades. Severe at 28 degrees. Cardiac arrest becomes likely. We're watching moderate hypothermia develop across this basement. Some men are already transitioning to severe. By morning, many will be dead. Kraus absorbed this information without visible reaction. Military training had prepared him to accept casualties, to make calculations about acceptable losses in pursuit of objectives. But this situation inverted all normal frameworks. These men were dying without enemy action, without tactical purpose, without anything that could be rationalized as military necessity. They were freezing to death in a basement because their supreme commander had refused to authorize a breakout that might have saved them months ago. 9 o'clock. Weber watched an older soldier across the basement lose consciousness, body slumping against the men beside him. The soldier was perhaps 50 years old. One of the reservists called up to fill casualties from younger conscripts. His name was Fischer. He had been a postal worker in Dresden before the war. Weber had shared guard duty with him in October, had listened to stories about Fischer's grandchildren, about his small apartment overlooking the Elbe River, about retirement plans that would never be realized. Now Fischer sat unresponsive, head tilted back, mouth open, breath coming in shallow gasps that grew progressively weaker. Hoffman crawled over bodies to reach Fischer, checking for pulse in the carotid artery. He found a heartbeat, faint and irregular, barely pushing blood through constricted vessels. Fischer's core temperature had dropped below the threshold for survival. His body was shutting down, organs failing sequentially as hypothermia claimed systems one by one. The doctor could do nothing except return to his position and wait for death to complete its work. 10 o'clock. Hans Kessler had stopped crying but had begun talking instead, words tumbling out in a stream of consciousness monologue directed at no one in particular. He described his family's farm in detail, the barn where they kept dairy cows, the fields where they grew barley and wheat, the kitchen where his mother baked bread every morning. His voice took on a childlike quality, regression to younger self-seeking comfort and memories of safety. Other men listened or ignored him according to their own psychological needs. Some found his voice a distraction from their own dying. Some found it unbearable, a reminder of everything they had lost. Schneider spoke for the first time in over an hour, words directed at Weber in a whisper that barely carried across the centimeters separating them. Anna doesn't know where I am. The letters I wrote, they're still in my pack. She'll wait for news that won't come. The baby will be born in March. I won't be there. I won't meet my child. Weber wanted to offer comfort, to provide assurance that Schneider would survive, that they would both survive this night and the nights after and eventually return home. But lies seemed obscene in circumstances where death was demonstrable and survival increasingly unlikely. He settled for gripping Schneider's arm through layers of frozen cloth, contact that conveyed what words could not. 11 o'clock. Shivering had begun to cease across the basement, muscles exhausting their fuel and falling still. Men who stopped shivering transitioned into moderate hypothermia's later stages, bodies conserving energy for core functions, extremities abandoned to save heart and brain. Skin took on grayish pallor visible even in the darkness. Breathing became slow and shallow. Consciousness wavered, attention fragmenting, thoughts becoming confused and disconnected. Weber recognized these symptoms in himself. His shivering had stopped 20 minutes earlier. His thoughts kept drifting, losing focus, starting chains of reasoning that led nowhere and dissolved before completion. He would realize with a sudden clarity that he had been staring at nothing for minutes. Mind blank, awareness suspended. Then clarity would fade again and he would drift back into a state that felt almost peaceful. Consciousness floating away from the cold and the hunger and the knowledge of approaching death. Fischer died sometime before midnight. Final breath so quiet that no one noticed the exact moment. His body remained upright, wedged between other soldiers, head tilted back as if he were sleeping. The corpse would freeze in this position over the coming hours, rigor mortis accelerated by temperatures that turned flesh to ice. Other men would not realize Fischer was dead until morning light allowed proper assessment. In darkness, the dead and the living were indistinguishable except for the absence of breath that no one could see. Midnight arrived without fanfare, without acknowledgement. Time had become abstract concept measured only by the progression of cold's assault on living tissue. Weber's internal sense of duration had collapsed. Minutes might have been hours. Hours might have been minutes. He existed in an eternal present dominated by cold, so complete it seemed to have physical presence, an entity pressing against him from all sides, squeezing heat from his core, replacing vitality with crystalline stillness. 3 more men lost consciousness in the minutes after midnight, bodies failing simultaneously as if coordinated by some external signal. Kraus tried to wake them, shaking shoulders, slapping faces, shouting names into ears that might still hear. 2 men stirred weakly, returning to consciousness for moments before drifting away again. The third remained unresponsive. pulse thready and irregular, breathing nearly imperceptible. Then paradox manifested. Hans Kessler suddenly stood, throwing off the men pressed against him, and began tearing at his uniform. His fingers fumbled with buttons, ripping fabric when fasteners would not cooperate. He wore a wild expression, eyes unfocused but frantic, movements urgent and uncoordinated. I'm burning. It's too hot. I need to get out of these clothes. Severe hypothermia creates sensation of intense heat as blood vessels dilate in a final autonomic response. Confused neural signals convincing dying brain that body is overheating. Victims remove clothing in desperate attempts to cool themselves. Accelerating heat loss, guaranteeing death. Hoffman recognized the symptom immediately and lunged for Kessler, trying to restrain him. But the young soldier's strength was amplified by panic and delirium. Other soldiers grabbed Kessler, 4 men holding him down while he thrashed and screamed about burning alive. They forced his jacket back on, buttoned it with frozen fingers, held him until his strength gave out and he collapsed back into the mass of bodies. But the damage was done. His exertion had burned through remaining energy reserves. His breathing became labored, consciousness fading even as men tried to keep him alert. Within 20 minutes, Kessler was dead, body relaxing into stillness, face settling into an expression of confused peace. Another soldier attempted the same thing minutes later, an older man named Bauer who had been sitting silently for hours. He managed to remove his coat entirely before being restrained, exposing himself to temperatures that flash froze exposed skin. Men wrestled the coat back onto him, but it was too late. Bauer's core temperature had dropped below critical threshold. He lost consciousness within minutes and died within the hour. Heart rhythm destabilizing into fibrillation and then stopping altogether. A third soldier, younger and stronger than the others, broke free of the men trying to hold him and ran for the stairs leading out of the basement. He wore only his undershirt. Having stripped off everything else in his delirium, Kraus shouted after him but could not move fast enough through the packed bodies to intercept. The soldier emerged into the wind and snow above, into cold that would kill him in minutes. They could hear him screaming outside for perhaps 3 minutes, voice growing weaker, then cutting off abruptly. When dawn came, they would find his body frozen solid, 10 meters from the basement entrance, skin white as porcelain, face twisted in final agony. Weber felt his own consciousness beginning to slip more frequently now. He would close his eyes for what seemed like seconds and open them to find that time had jumped forward by minutes or more. The cold had stopped feeling like cold. It had become a neutral state, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. Simply the way things were. His body felt distant, sensation retreating from extremities toward core, peripheral shutdown protecting vital organs for as long as possible. Hallucinations began spreading through the basement after midnight. Men spoke to people who were not present, described scenes that existed only in dying brains. One soldier carried on a conversation with his wife, describing dinner they were about to eat, thanking her for bringing him a warm blanket. Another argued with an invisible superior officer about leave that had been denied. A third recited childhood prayers in a small voice, asking God to protect his family, to forgive his sins, to grant him peace. Schneider hallucinated around 1 a.m, his speech becoming animated for the first time in hours. He described Anna in detail. How she looked pregnant, how she moved with new carefulness, how she talked to the baby inside her. He told Weber that Anna was in the basement with them, that she had come to Stalingrad to bring him home. He reached toward empty space as if taking her hand, smile crossing his gaunt face, tears freezing in tracks down his cheeks. Weber tried to orient him, to explain that Anna was in Bremen, that they were alone in a frozen basement in Russia. But Schneider could not process correction. His hallucination was more real to him than the basement, more vivid than the cold. A refuge his mind had constructed against the unbearable reality of freezing to death thousands of kilometers from home. Weber stopped trying to contradict him. If Schneider found comfort in delusion, who was Weber to take that comfort away? Then Schneider's lucidity returned for a moment, hallucination fragmenting, awareness crashing back with terrible clarity. He turned to Weber, recognition in his eyes, and his face crumpled. She wasn't here. I was seeing things. God, Klaus, I'm dying. I'm actually dying, and I won't see her again. I won't meet my child. They'll grow up without me, and I won't even be a memory. Just a name they're told belonged to their father. Weber gripped Schneider's hand, their frozen fingers intertwining awkwardly. No words existed that could make this bearable. The only truth was that Schneider was correct. He was dying. They were all dying. The cold was absolute. 2 a.m, as near as Weber could estimate without means to measure time precisely. The wind outside had reached peak intensity. howling like something alive and malevolent, driving snow horizontally through ruins with force that made walls vibrate. Temperature in the basement had equilibrated with outside air. No insulation remaining to create differential. The thermometer would have read -42 if anyone could have seen it. If mercury had not frozen solid hours earlier, deaths were accelerating. Every few minutes, another man stopped breathing, heart giving out as hypothermia disrupted electrical signals coordinating cardiac rhythm. Bodies slumped and remained slumped, muscles too cold and rigid to support weight any longer. The living lacked strength to move the dead, could only sit pressed against corpses that were rapidly freezing into ice sculptures of their final moments. Weber's thoughts had fragmented completely. He could no longer maintain coherent chains of reasoning, could not remember why he was in this basement or what had happened before this moment. Memory had collapsed into disconnected images. Greta's face when she was 3 years old, laughing at something he had said. Maria reading in bed at their apartment in Munich. A summer day before the war when they had picnicked beside the Isar River and everything had seemed impossibly perfect. The images felt more real than the basement, more substantial than the frozen bodies around him. Weber understood distantly that this meant he was dying. That hallucination was a symptom of severe hypothermia, that his brain was shutting down as core temperature dropped toward lethal levels. But the knowledge existed separate from emotion. He felt surprisingly peaceful. Death would be easier than continuing to fight the cold. The alternative was surviving only to freeze again tomorrow night and the night after, enduring this torture repeatedly until it finally killed him. He thought about Greta one final time, about her question from his last leave home. "Papa, when are you coming home?" "Soon." Liebling. He had told her, "Soon." The lie seemed both tragic and necessary. Better she remember him promising to return than know he had understood even then that he might never see her again. Weber's consciousness dissolved gradually rather than switching off completely. The basement faded. Cold faded. Awareness of his body faded. He existed in a space without sensation, without thought, floating in darkness that was neither frightening nor comforting, simply neutral. The last thing he experienced before oblivion was a vague sense of release, as if something that had been holding him together had finally let go. Then nothing. 6 in the morning. January 9th, a sergeant named Gottfried Richter moved through the basement checking for survivors. Richter was 42 years old, a career NCO who had survived the previous war and had survived this one through a combination of competence, luck, and ruthless pragmatism. He had been in a different section of the basement during the night, separated from Weber's group by a collapsed wall. His section had lost 8 of 20 men. Now he was inventorying the entire space, determining who could still fight and who would need evacuation. Richter checked each man systematically, looking for signs of breathing, feeling for pulses in necks or wrists. Many were obviously dead, skin gone pale gray, bodies frozen in positions they would never leave. Others were unconscious but still alive, hearts still beating weakly, lungs still drawing shallow breaths. The sergeant marked the living with chalk on their jackets, quick designation that would allow medics to prioritize evacuation. The dead he left unmarked, they would be dealt with later, if at all. When Richter reached Weber, he found no immediate signs of life. Weber's skin was cold to the touch. Lips blue, eyes closed, body slumped against Schneider. The sergeant almost moved on to the next man, almost wrote Weber off as another corpse. But training made him check carefully. Fingers pressing against carotid artery, searching for pulse that should not exist but might. Faint pressure against his fingertips. Irregular rhythm, barely present but undeniable. Weber was alive. Richter shook Weber violently, hands gripping frozen cloth, pulling him upright, slapping his face with force that snapped the head side to side. No response. He shook harder, shouting Weber's name, trying to penetrate whatever depth of unconsciousness had claimed him. Still nothing. He was about to give up when Weber's eyelids flickered, opened slightly, pupils dilated and unfocused but aware. Weber tried to speak, but his mouth would not work properly. Jaw muscles had frozen during the night. Tongue felt swollen and foreign. He managed a slight nod instead. Confirmation of consciousness. Signal that some part of him still functioned. Richter marked his jacket with chalk and moved to the next man. The next man was Schneider. Richter checked for pulse. Found none. Checked breathing. Found none. Schneider sat in the exact position he had occupied when Weber lost consciousness. Body frozen in place. Eyes half open. One hand extended toward where Weber had been, as if reaching for contact in final moments. Frost covered his face. Crystallized breath frozen to his skin and uniform. He looked peaceful. Expression relaxed. as if he had simply fallen asleep and decided not to wake. Weber stared at Schneider's corpse, brain slowly processing what eyes saw. Dead. Schneider was dead. His friend since training, his companion through France and Russia, the man who had talked endlessly about Anna and the baby and home, was dead. Had died while Weber slept. While Weber had retreated into unconsciousness, had died alone despite sitting pressed against someone who might have helped, might have kept him awake, might have made some difference. Grief tried to surface but could not penetrate the fog of hypothermia and exhaustion. Weber felt nothing except a distant recognition that he should feel something. Schneider's death registered as fact without emotional weight. Later, if there was a later, there would be time for mourning. Now there was only survival, only the necessity of staying alive through the next hour and the hour after that. Richter completed his inventory and reported to Kraus, who had survived the night in marginally better condition than most. 15 men alive, 33 dead. The mathematics were precise and terrible. Nearly 70% casualties without a single shot fired, without enemy action, without anything that could be called battle. The cold had accomplished what Soviet forces had failed to accomplish through months of urban warfare. It had destroyed a platoon-strength element in a single night. The living tried to stand and mostly failed. Legs would not support weight. Feet had frozen, tissue damage making walking impossible. 2 soldiers who had been sitting near the entrance crawled to the stairs and pulled themselves up using hands and arms, dragging useless legs behind them. Others needed help, needed to be carried by soldiers who barely had strength to carry themselves. Weber attempted to stand and discovered his legs were completely non-functional. Below the knees, nothing responded to neural commands. He looked down at his feet and saw they had turned black. Tissue completely dead, frozen solid in his boots. Gangrene would set in within days if the tissue was not removed. Amputation was inevitable. The only question was whether he would survive long enough to reach a field hospital where Hoffman or another surgeon could perform the operation. 2 soldiers lifted Weber and carried him toward the stairs, supporting his weight between them as they struggled up steps made treacherous by ice. They emerged into morning light that seemed impossibly bright after hours of absolute darkness. Weber's eyes could not adjust immediately, seeing only white glare that obscured everything. Then details resolved. Ruins. Snow. Corpses. The landscape was hell frozen over. Stalingrad had been reduced to rubble by months of fighting and by German aerial bombardment before the battle began. Every building was damaged or destroyed. Walls collapsed into piles of brick and concrete. Streets buried under debris. Snow covered everything, accumulating in drifts against ruins, filling shell craters, obscuring the distinction between ground and wreckage. Bodies were everywhere. German soldiers killed in recent fighting lay where they had fallen, their corpses freezing in whatever positions death had found them. Soviet soldiers killed in the same engagements mixed with German dead, enemies made equal by shared mortality. Horses that had been slaughtered for meat lay partially butchered, frozen solid before all usable flesh could be harvested. Rats frozen in the act of feeding on corpses. Birds dead in mid-flight, falling from the sky when cold exceeded their tolerance. The bodies from the night's freeze were adding to this count. Across the German pocket, the same scene that had played out in Weber's basement had repeated in thousands of other locations. Soldiers sheltering in ruins, in trenches, in bunkers, in any space that offered minimal protection from wind, had frozen to death by the thousands. Bodies were being dragged out of shelters now, stacked in the open because there was no possibility of burial and no time to deal with the dead when the living were still dying. Richter organized the evacuation of Weber's position, sending the wounded toward a field hospital 3 blocks away, posting the survivors who could still hold weapons to defensive positions. Soviet forces were not attacking this sector currently, but they could resume their offensive at any time. German forces could not afford to abandon positions even when those positions were held by soldiers who could barely stand. Weber was carried to the hospital, a basement beneath what had once been a school. The entrance required descending stairs into darkness, lit by a few candles. The smell hit before eyes adjusted to the gloom. Blood and gangrene and human waste and death, concentrated in an enclosed space without ventilation. 300 soldiers crowded into a basement designed for perhaps 50. Wounded lay on the floor in rows, some on stretchers, most on bare ground, some on top of corpses because there was no room elsewhere. Hoffman was there, operating at a table improvised from doors laid across crates. He wore a blood-stained apron over his uniform, had not slept in what looked like days. His hands moved with mechanical efficiency, cutting tissue, tying off blood vessels, amputating limbs that could not be saved. A pile of severed arms and legs accumulated in the corner, frozen flesh stacked like cordwood because there was nowhere else to put them. Weber was placed on the floor near a wall, wedged between other wounded. The man to his left was unconscious, missing both hands, stumps wrapped in bandages that had soaked through with blood. The man to his right was awake and screaming, infection from a shrapnel wound, turning his leg gangrenous, tissue rotting while he waited for amputation that might come too late to save his life. Hoffman worked his way through the casualties, triaging ruthlessly. Men with superficial wounds were ignored, sent back to their units with minimal treatment. Men with moderate injuries got basic first aid, bandages and splints, nothing more. Men with severe injuries requiring surgery were added to the queue, waiting their turn at the table where the doctor sawed through frozen flesh without anesthesia, without adequate instruments, without any of the supplies that would have made his work humane rather than butchery. When Hoffman reached Weber, he examined the blackened feet with professional detachment, pressing tissue that did not respond, checking circulation that had ceased. His assessment was immediate and definitive. Both feet are completely necrotic. Gangrene will set in within 72 hours if I don't amputate. Infection will spread to your legs, then to your bloodstream. Sepsis will kill you in less than a week. I need to take them both. Weber nodded. He had known this was coming from the moment he saw his feet that morning. Delaying would not change the diagnosis. Better to endure the operation now while he still had some strength than to wait until infection weakened him further. Hoffman added Weber to the queue. 4 soldiers ahead of him needed amputations. Each operation took approximately 30 minutes when nothing went wrong, longer when complications developed. Weber would wait perhaps 3 hours, maybe 4, lying on the floor listening to other men scream when the saw bit into their flesh, knowing his turn was approaching, knowing that he would scream the same way when his time came. The waiting was worse than the cold had been. Hypothermia had offered eventual unconsciousness, escape into oblivion where pain could not reach. This offered only anticipation, only the knowledge that agony was coming and that consciousness would persist through every second. Weber tried to distract himself by remembering home, by thinking about Maria and Greta, by constructing plans for what he would do after the war if he survived. But all thoughts led back to the table where Hoffman was sawing through another soldier's leg, to the screams that echoed through the basement, to the inevitable moment when it would be his turn. Captain Dmitry Volkov observed the German pocket from his forward position on the Soviet lines. Binoculars trained on enemy positions 800 meters away. The Germans were moving differently today. Slower, more erratically, carrying more wounded, dragging out bodies in numbers that suggested something catastrophic had occurred during the night. Volkov had monitored the temperature drop, had known that minus 42 degrees would kill men who lacked adequate shelter and clothing. But seeing the evidence of mass casualties created an unexpected complexity in his mind. These were invaders, men who had burned Soviet villages and killed Soviet civilians and perpetrated atrocities across the Western territories. They deserved no sympathy. They had brought this suffering on themselves through their aggression, through their invasion, through their service to a fascist regime that sought to exterminate entire populations. Volkov's family was dead because of Germans. His village was ashes because of Germans. He owed them nothing except the duty to destroy them. But watching men freeze to death, even enemy men, even men who deserved their fate, troubled some part of him that remained capable of recognizing shared humanity. They were dying badly, dying in ways that no soldier should die, abandoned by their own leadership, trapped in a pocket that their high command had created through strategic incompetence. Professional respect for suffering endured could coexist with hatred for the invasion that had made that suffering necessary. Volkov drafted his daily intelligence report for higher command, quantifying German casualties based on observation and on interrogations of prisoners captured during the night. Estimated 15 to 20,000 German soldiers dead from cold exposure during January 8 to 9. So German combat effectiveness severely degraded across the pocket. Morale collapsing. Resistance to future Soviet offensives expected to be minimal. Recommendation: delay major attacks for 1 week. Allow cold to further weaken German forces. Then launch final offensive to eliminate the pocket. The strategy was efficient. Soviet casualties would be minimized if they waited for cold to do the work of artillery and infantry. German casualties would be maximized, not just in numbers, but in psychological impact on survivors who would carry memories of this frozen hell for whatever brief time they had left. Volkov approved this strategy even as some buried part of him recoiled from the coldness of it. From the calculation that assigned value to human suffering based solely on its utility in achieving military objectives. 3 soldiers brought a German prisoner to Volkov's position around noon, a young enlisted man captured during a failed supply run. The prisoner was emaciated, hollow-eyed, shivering uncontrollably despite the relative warmth of daylight temperatures that had risen to -30. Volkov interrogated him in German, asking standard questions about unit strength and defensive positions, getting answers that confirmed what observation had already revealed. Then Volkov asked about the night. How many died in your position? The prisoner stared at nothing for a long moment before answering. Everyone, no one, I don't know anymore. I counted bodies this morning, 33 in our basement. But I heard numbers from other positions. Hundreds, thousands. We're all dead. Some of us just haven't stopped breathing yet. Volkov dismissed the prisoner, sent him to the rear where other captured Germans would be processed and eventually transported to prison camps. Most would not survive captivity. Soviet resources barely fed their own soldiers and civilians. German prisoners were lowest priority, receiving minimal food and shelter, dying from starvation and disease and cold at rates that approached the deaths occurring in the pocket. The Soviets were not obligated to save enemies who had invaded their country. The Germans would receive what minimal treatment international law required and nothing more. Across the pocket, similar scenes were unfolding in every German position. Men waking to count their dead. Men discovering that friends and comrades had frozen beside them during the night. Men confronting the reality that they had survived when better men had died. That survival itself was random and meaningless. That another night would come and kill more of them, and there was nothing anyone could do to prevent it. In a bunker on the southern edge of the pocket, an entire artillery battery had frozen at their guns. 40 men dead, still in firing positions. Hands frozen to metal that had become cold enough to burn skin on contact. In a hospital near the center of the pocket, 200 patients and staff had died when fuel for their heating stove ran out during the night. Bodies filled corridors, stacked 3 deep in rooms, frozen solid before anyone could move them. Division headquarters received reports throughout the morning. Fragmentary accounts of catastrophic losses across the pocket. Radio operators tallied numbers. 1st Battalion, 70% casualties from cold exposure. 2nd Battalion cannot account for entire company presumed frozen. Artillery regiment lost 800 men. Field hospital overwhelmed with frostbite cases requiring amputation. The numbers accumulated into a loss estimate that staggered even commanders who had witnessed months of brutal attrition. General Paulus received the reports in his headquarters bunker and forwarded them to Hitler with a request that had become routine and that would be denied with equal routine. Permission to break out of encirclement. Permission to attempt withdrawal while the 6th Army retained enough strength to march. Permission to prioritize survival of his soldiers over the symbolic value of holding a city that had already been destroyed. The request would go to Berlin, would be considered by men who understood nothing of conditions in the pocket, would be rejected because admission that Stalingrad must be abandoned would require admission that Hitler's strategy had failed. Weber's turn came at the amputation table 4 hours after he had been added to the queue. Hoffman looked worse than he had that morning. Exhaustion written in every line of his face. Hands that had been steady for hours beginning to tremble slightly. He had amputated perhaps 20 limbs since dawn, had watched half his patients die from shock or blood loss on the table or in the hours immediately following surgery. But he could not stop. More men needed amputation. More men would die without it. The work continued because the alternative was abandoning soldiers to certain death from gangrene. 4 soldiers held Weber down, 2 gripping his arms, 2 holding his legs immobile. Hoffman positioned the surgical saw against Weber's right leg, measuring carefully to ensure the cut would be made through healthy tissue above the ankle where dead flesh ended and living tissue began. He looked at Weber with something approaching apology in his eyes. This will hurt worse than anything you've experienced. I have no morphine, no anesthesia of any kind. I'll work as fast as I can, but you need to stay still. If you move, I could cut an artery and you'll bleed out before I can tie it off. Weber nodded understanding. The soldiers tightened their grips. Hoffman began to cut. The pain was absolute, worse than burning, worse than any wound Weber had suffered in combat. The saw teeth bit through skin and muscle and bone, each stroke sending agony shooting up his leg into his spine and brain. He screamed, could not stop screaming. Voice that had been silent for hours found full volume, shrieking until his throat went raw. The soldiers holding him bore down with all their weight as his body convulsed, instinct demanding escape from this torture while consciousness understood there was no escape. Hoffman worked with mechanical efficiency, sawing through bone, cutting tissue, tying off blood vessels with surgical thread to prevent hemorrhage. The operation took 12 minutes for the first foot, 12 minutes that felt like hours, like days, like an eternity of suffering compressed into a space so small it should not have been able to contain this much pain. Then the saw withdrew, pressure released, and Weber's consciousness fragmented into darkness. He woke to Hoffman starting the second amputation. The brief mercy of unconsciousness had ended too soon. The saw bit into his left leg and the screaming began again. Sounds torn from a throat that barely functioned. Animal noises that bore no resemblance to human speech. Somewhere during the second operation, Weber's mind broke free of his body. Consciousness floating above the table. Watching this scene from outside himself, he saw the doctor sawing through his leg, saw the soldiers holding down his thrashing body, saw the blood spreading across the table and dripping onto the floor. He felt the pain from a distance, acknowledged it without being consumed by it, existed in a state of dissociation that was the mind's final defense against unbearable trauma. When Hoffman finished, Weber was carried to a section of the floor where other amputees lay. Dozens of men missing limbs, some conscious and whimpering, some unconscious, some already dead from complications. He was placed on bare ground, no stretcher available, no blanket to cover him. Stumps wrapped in bandages torn from a shirt because medical supplies had been exhausted weeks ago. The wounds would become infected. Most amputations became infected in these conditions. Whether infection would kill him before cold or starvation claimed him was uncertain. All three were racing to see which would finish the job first. Weber lay staring at the ceiling of the basement, mind slowly returning to his body. Pain from his stumps building as shock wore off and nerves began reporting damage to a brain that could do nothing except register agony. He thought about Schneider, about the promise he had made to tell Anna what had happened. He thought about the other 32 men who had died in that basement, about whether anyone would remember their names or tell their families how they had frozen in the darkness. He thought about whether survival was worth this price, whether living as a cripple in constant pain was preferable to the peaceful death Schneider had found. No answers came. Just pain and cold and the certainty that morning would bring another frozen night and another until either the Soviets killed him or his body finally gave up the fight it had been losing since November. The count was 33 dead in one basement, 15 to 20,000 dead across the pocket. And the winter was far from over. Weber survived because infection chose mercy. The fever came on the third day as Hoffman had predicted. His body temperature spiking until delirium replaced coherent thought, and he spoke to ghosts who crowded around his floor space in the hospital basement. Schneider visited, asking about Anna and the baby. Maria and Greta appeared, their faces shifting between memory and hallucination. Fischer, the postal worker, offered to deliver letters that Weber had never written. The dead wanted answers he could not provide. On the seventh day, the fever broke. Hoffman changed the bandages and found tissue healing badly, but healing nonetheless. The stumps were closing, ragged edges knitting together through sheer biological stubbornness despite conditions that killed most amputees. Weber's immune system had somehow mustered response adequate to contain bacterial invasion. He would live, though whether survival constituted fortune or curse remained unanswerable. The hospital basement existed in a state beyond overcrowding. 300 wounded occupied space designed for 50 men lay in rows so tightly packed that orderlies could not walk between them without stepping over bodies. The smell of gangrene and human waste had become so pervasive that newcomers vomited upon entry while veterans no longer noticed. Hoffman moved through this nightmare landscape, operating continuously, sleeping 2 hours per night in a chair, sustained only by duty and the knowledge that stopping meant abandoning soldiers to certain death. Weber learned to ignore the screaming. Every day brought new amputees to the table, new men discovering that agony had depths beyond imagination, new voices joining the chorus of the dying. He learned not to form attachments. The soldier occupying the space to his left would be dead within days, replaced by another who would also die. Then another, an endless cycle where names became pointless and everyone was temporary. Klaus visited in mid-January, navigating through the rows of broken men. The Oberst had aged a decade in 2 months, flesh consumed until his uniform hung like drapery on skeletal frame. But when he spoke to Weber, command authority remained intact. You're being evacuated. Soviets are closing on this position. We're withdrawing to a hospital near Göring airfield. You'll be flown out when transport becomes available. Weber knew the evacuation promise was fiction. Luftwaffe flights had become so rare that hundreds of wounded would wait for transport that would never arrive. But he accepted the lie without comment because what else could he do? The withdrawal occurred January 18th through streets where every building had been reduced to rubble and where corpses lined routes like mile markers. Soviet artillery tracked the columns, shells falling among wounded men who had survived the freeze only to die from shrapnel during evacuation. They reached the new hospital by nightfall, another basement already packed with casualties. Another space where men died hourly and where the living waited their turn. Late January brought Soviet offensives that systematically carved apart what remained of the German pocket. Artillery bombardments preceded infantry assaults that overwhelmed positions held by soldiers too weak to resist effectively. The pocket shrank daily. German forces collapsing inward, abandoning ground they had paid for with thousands of lives. The airfield at Gumrak fell January 22nd, eliminating the last runway where transport aircraft could land. Supply drops by parachute became the only means of delivery, and most supplies drifted into Soviet-held territory or scattered across no man's land where neither side could retrieve them. Rations ceased almost entirely. Weber received perhaps 30 grams of bread every 3 days, supplemented by nothing except snow melted for water. His body had adapted to starvation during the encirclement, metabolism slowing, organ function reducing to absolute minimum necessary for survival. He watched other amputees die from hunger, their bodies shutting down sequentially as the final calories were consumed. Starvation death was slower than freezing, but equally certain, a gradual fading where consciousness dimmed over days until it simply never returned. January 31st. Soviet soldiers descended the hospital stairs mid-morning, rifles ready, shouting orders Weber could not understand. German soldiers who could stand raised their hands. Those who could not remained on the floor waiting to see whether they would be shot or captured. The Soviets worked efficiently, separating wounded by mobility, collecting what few weapons remained, establishing control over men too broken to resist. A Soviet medic examined Weber's stumps with clinical detachment. He shouted something to an officer, gestured at Weber, received a response. Then the medic produced bread from his pack, half a loaf of black bread that seemed impossibly large after weeks of near starvation. He handed it to Weber. "You live hospital prisoner now." Weber ate the bread slowly over 30 minutes, forcing himself not to consume it too quickly, despite hunger demanding he devour it whole. Eating too fast after prolonged starvation could kill the digestive system, unable to process sudden influx of nutrients. He made the bread last, feeling strength return in small increments as his body absorbed nutrition it had been denied for months. Capture had saved him. Soviet captivity would prove terrible in ways he could not yet imagine, but it provided marginally better conditions than remaining in the German pocket where death from starvation was imminent and certain. The Soviets had food, had medical infrastructure, had reasons to keep prisoners alive even if only as labor resources. Weber would survive because he had become Soviet property. Captain Volkov toured captured German positions February 2nd, the day after Paulus surrendered and organized resistance ceased in the southern pocket. He walked through basements where dozens of Germans sat frozen upright at defensive positions, weapons across laps, eyes open and staring. They had frozen at their posts during the worst nights, bodies preserved by cold, creating museums of war's brutality. He entered hospitals where patients had died in their beds, where surgical tables held corpses mid-operation, where piles of amputated limbs had accumulated in corners like cordwood. One position held 200 German corpses and 12 living men, barely distinguishable from the dead. Volkov watched medics separate the living from the frozen and felt something that might have been pity mixing with professional satisfaction. These invaders had brought this catastrophe upon themselves through their aggression, through their service to a regime that sought to exterminate Soviet populations. They deserved their suffering, but watching the scale of that suffering created complications in Volkov's understanding of justice and necessity. His intelligence reports documented German casualties with precision, estimated 210,000 dead from the 300,000 trapped in November, 50,000 killed in combat, 160,000 dead from starvation, cold, and disease. The freeze night of January 8th and 9th alone had killed 15 to 20,000 one night. No enemy action, just cold and leadership failure and men abandoned to die for symbolic objectives. Volkov was assigned to interrogate prisoners. Standard intelligence gathering now rendered almost pointless because the battle was over and German forces destroyed. But protocol demanded interviews, and Volkov conducted them in a basement converted to interrogation facility. Most prisoners were too broken to provide useful information. Their responses mechanical recitations of suffering that varied only in detail. Weber was brought before him February 8th, carried on a stretcher because mobility required legs. Volkov reviewed the file. Gefreiter Klaus Weber, 31 years old, married with one daughter, pre-read 89th Infantry Division. Both feet amputated due to frostbite. No evidence of war crimes or atrocities. Standard infantry soldier. The interrogation began with routine questions about unit strength and positions, information already obsolete. Weber answered mechanically, providing details that no longer mattered to anyone. Then Volkov shifted to questions about conditions in the pocket, about the freeze night. How many died in your position that night? Weber's eyes focused on Volkov for the first time. Recognition of shared humanity passing between interrogator and prisoner. 33 out of 48 We counted them at dawn, found them frozen where they sat. My friend Martin Schneider died beside me. He had a wife pregnant with their first child. He died thinking about them. That's what cold does. It kills you while you're thinking about home. Volkov noted the testimony, adding it to accumulating evidence of catastrophic German losses. Then he asked the question that mattered to him personally, though he could not articulate why. Why did you invade us? Weber held his gaze, answer coming after long pause. I followed orders. That's not an excuse. Just a fact. I didn't choose this war, but I fought in it. I invaded your country. I helped destroy your cities. The cold that took my feet. The starvation that nearly killed me. I brought it on myself by being here. Your family probably died because of soldiers like me. I can't make that right. I can only tell you what happened and accept whatever comes next. Volkov felt something shift in his understanding of responsibility and guilt. Most prisoners disclaimed personal responsibility. Blamed leaders, claimed they had no choice. Weber's acknowledgement of culpability while maintaining honesty about his limited agency was unusual. It suggested moral complexity that had survived brutalization. You'll be sent to prison camp. Many prisoners don't survive, but you've survived worse. Maybe you'll be one who makes it home. The transport to camp began mid-February. Columns of prisoners marched east under guard while those who could not walk rode in wagons. Weber lay in wagon beds surrounded by other wounded. Men missing limbs or suffering from injuries that would never properly heal. The cold continued. Temperatures well below freezing. Wind cutting through inadequate clothing. Men died during the march. Bodies dumped beside roads because prisoners lacked strength to carry corpses and guards saw no purpose in burial. The camp was 300 kilometers east of Stalingrad. Wooden barracks surrounded by wire and towers. 5,000 German prisoners arrived through spring. Remnants of 90,000 who had surrendered. The rest had died during marches or been separated to other facilities. Conditions were brutal. 600 calories daily, barely adequate for sedentary existence, and woefully insufficient for labor details. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Weber was assigned to scrap metal sorting, work he could perform sitting, using hands to separate materials. Other prisoners went to logging camps or construction sites where physical demands exceeded capacity and where death rates reached 50% within months. Weber's disability saved him from work that would have killed him, but survival required more than avoiding lethal labor. The first winter in captivity killed 2,000 of the 5,000 prisoners. Men who had survived Stalingrad died from cold and starvation and disease in camps where conditions were marginally better than the pocket, but still far below what bodies needed. Weber survived because his system had adapted, because metabolism had learned to function on minimal calories, because resilience developed during encirclement carried him through when others failed. He also survived because he found purpose. He kept mental records of men from his company, memorizing names and stories, determined to testify if he ever returned home. Schneider, who had frozen dreaming of Anna and their child. Fischer, the postal worker from Dresden. Hans Kessler from Bavaria, who had cried for his mother. 33 names from one basement, hundreds from his company across months of encirclement. The memorial existed only in Weber's mind, but he maintained it with devotion that bordered on obsession. Remembering was duty, obligation to the dead who had no one else to speak their names. One morning in spring 1947, Weber was sorting scrap when he saw a familiar face among new arrivals being processed into the camp. Ernst Hoffmann, looking 10 years older than his actual age, hair completely white, but eyes retaining their essential kindness. Recognition was mutual and immediate. They embraced as well as men could embrace when one had no legs and both were skeletal. Hoffmann had survived the Stalingrad pocket, had been captured when the northern sector surrendered 2 days after Paulus's surrender, had spent 4 years working as medical officer in a camp further east treating Soviet civilians. His hands no longer shook. His skills had saved him from the worst labor details, made him valuable enough to keep alive. But his memories of Stalingrad remained vivid and terrible. That night they sat together in the barracks, speaking quietly while other prisoners slept around them. I saved your life in Stalingrad. Don't know if that was mercy or cruelty. Looking at this place, I'm less certain than I was then. You've survived 4 years already. That's longer than most. Maybe you'll actually make it home. Weber wanted to believe, but had learned not to hope. Men who survived one day often died the next. Tuberculosis. Typhus. Simple exhaustion. The prison camp killed efficiently, if less dramatically than the freeze night had killed. They developed routine of mutual support over the following months. Hoffmann's medical knowledge earned him marginally better rations, which he shared when possible. Weber's sorting work was less physically demanding, allowing him to conserve energy. They talked about Stalingrad when talking seemed necessary, sharing memories that no one else could understand. The 33 men in the basement, the amputations without anesthesia. The mathematical certainty of doom combined with biological imperative to survive despite that certainty. Hoffman spoke one night about his guilt. I amputated 200 limbs during the encirclement. Maybe 60% of those men died anyway from infection or blood loss or just from accumulated damage. I was supposed to heal people. Instead, I became a butcher. I kept working because stopping meant abandoning them entirely. But I don't know if I helped or just prolonged suffering. Weber understood that guilt carried his own version. Why had he survived when Schneider died? They had sat pressed together, endured identical conditions, yet Weber lived and Schneider froze. Randomness explained survival but did not make it easier to accept. March 1953 brought news that filtered slowly through the camp. Stalin was dead. Guards and administrators seemed uncertain what this meant for their positions. 4 camp operations. For the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners still held across the Soviet Union. Prisoner releases began that summer as new Soviet leadership negotiated with West Germany. The releases were selective, prioritizing disabled prisoners who posed no security threat and whose continued captivity served no purpose. 2 months before selections began, Hoffman contracted typhus while treating other prisoners. The disease progressed rapidly in a body weakened by 6 years of malnutrition. He worked until the day before he died, maintaining his duty to heal even when healing himself was impossible. Weber sat with him through the final hours, holding the doctor's hand as fever consumed him. Hoffman's last words were delivered in whisper, eyes unfocused but voice clear. Tell them what happened in Stalingrad. Tell them how we suffered. Tell them it was preventable. Tell them leadership failed us. Tell them the truth. Weber added that obligation to his existing memorial. He would testify for Schneider, for Fischer, for Kessler, for Hoffman, for all the dead who deserved witnesses. October 1953. Weber's name appeared on the release list. Disabled. No security threat. More useful to diplomatic negotiations repatriated than kept in camps. The train journey west took 3 weeks, traveling through Soviet territory into East Germany and finally to West Germany, where repatriation processing occurred. Weber saw his reflection in a window during the journey and barely recognized the skeletal figure in the wheelchair. He was 42 years old and looked 70, 50 kilograms, no legs, tuberculosis damaged lungs, decades of malnutrition-related health problems that would never fully heal. But he was alive, going home, carrying stories of the dead back to the living who needed to hear them. Munich in November 1953 seemed both familiar and alien. The train station had been rebuilt from bombing damage. The streets showed scars of war overlaid with reconstruction. Weber's family had been notified of his return, provided with date and time of arrival. He saw them from the platform. Maria aged by more than 11 years, hair gray, face lined by stress. Greta now 18, a young woman who bore little resemblance to the 7-year-old from his last leave. They saw him in the wheelchair and stopped. Shock, grief, forced composure. Maria approached slowly, kneeling beside the chair, reaching for his hands, then pulling back when she saw frostbite scarring. Klaus, you're alive. We thought you were dead for years. Then the Red Cross notification. I didn't know if I should hope. Her voice broke. Weber found his own voice after months of speaking only to fellow prisoners. I was at Stalingrad. We were trapped, frozen, starved. I lost my feet to frostbite. Spent 10 years in Soviet camps. But I'm here. I'm alive. That makes me fortunate. Greta hung back, studying him with clinical curiosity. She had been too young when he left to remember him clearly. The father she had invented from photographs and imagination matched nothing about this broken man in a wheelchair. The reunion continued at their apartment, small space in a building that had survived the bombing. Maria prepared food, simple meal that seemed impossibly rich after years of prison rations. Weber ate slowly, stomach unable to process normal quantities. He answered their questions about captivity, editing worst details, trying to make his experience comprehensible to people who had never known hunger beyond inconvenience or cold beyond discomfort. But he could not hide the nightmares. They started the first night home. Weber woke screaming about cold and frozen bodies and Schneider's hand in his, and the 33 corpses counted at dawn. Maria held him while he shook. While he described the freeze night in detail he had not shared during waking hours, the dreams continued every night, sometimes multiple times. Fragments of trauma that his brain could not process and would not forget. Depression followed within weeks. Weber could not function in civilian life, could not work because of physical disabilities and psychological damage, could not engage with normal activities that seemed trivial compared to what he had survived. He sat in the apartment staring at nothing, retreating into himself, drinking when he could afford alcohol because it dulled memories even as it created new problems. Maria struggled to care for him, to manage finances on disability pension, to maintain hope that he would eventually recover enough to rejoin life. Greta maintained careful distance, interacting with her father minimally, clearly uncomfortable with his presence and his constant distress. Weber forced himself to fulfill obligations to the dead in early 1954. He traveled to Bremen to visit Anna Schneider. She lived alone in the apartment where she and Martin had lived before the war. Their daughter, born March 1943, was 11 now, a quiet girl who watched Weber with solemn eyes. Anna had received notification in 1943 that Martin was missing at Stalingrad, presumed dead. No body recovered. No confirmation beyond his name on lists of soldiers who had not returned. She had raised their daughter alone, working factory jobs, maintaining hope that perhaps Martin had survived in Soviet captivity and would eventually come home. Weber's visit destroyed that hope while providing closure she had needed for 11 years. He told her about Schneider's last words, about the promise to tell her Martin loved her, to tell their daughter about him. He described how Schneider had died, frozen beside him in the basement, hallucinating about seeing Anna one final time before death claimed him. Anna cried while Weber spoke, grief suspended for years finally finding release. When he finished, she looked at him with expression combining anger and desperate need for understanding. Why did you survive when he died? You were sitting beside each other. Same conditions. Why are you here telling me this and he's still frozen in Russia? Weber had no answer except truth. I don't know. It was random. Schneider was a better man, better husband, would have been better father. I survived by accident. No reason. No justice? Just chance. I wish I could tell you differently. The conversation haunted him for months, adding to guilt that already consumed him. He began attending Stalingrad survivors groups when they formed, monthly meetings where men shared memories and supported each other through trauma that set them apart from other veterans. The groups dwindled over years as members died from war-related health problems or from suicide. Suicide rates among Stalingrad survivors were catastrophically high, men finding peacetime unbearable and choosing death over continuing to live with their memories. Weber considered suicide frequently but never acted. He had promises to keep, to Schneider, to Hoffman, to the 33 men from the basement. He had to survive to testify, to ensure their deaths were documented, to tell truth about what had happened when German leadership abandoned an entire army for symbolic objectives. A documentary filmmaker contacted him in 1985 requesting interview. Weber agreed, seeing it as opportunity to fulfill obligations one final time. The filming occurred in his apartment. Camera and lights arranged in the small living room. He was 73 years old, health failing, but memory of Stalingrad remained precise. The filmmaker asked at the about the freeze night tonight. Weber closed his eyes and returned to that basement, to the cold that had been absolute, to the bodies that had frozen around him, to Schneider's hand gripping his. He spoke for 30 minutes without interruption. I remember the cold more than anything else. Not the fighting. Not the fear of being killed by Russians. Just the cold. It was cold that killed most of us. We froze because we had been abandoned. Because nobody was coming to rescue us. Because Hitler would not let us try to escape. We knew we were going to die. And there was nothing we could do about it. His voice remained steady, though tears ran down his face. I survived by accident. Many better men than me died that night. Schneider was beside me when he died. I was unconscious. Didn't even know he was gone until morning. He had a wife, a baby on the way. He should have survived. Should have raised his daughter. I don't know why I lived and he died. Never will. The interviewer asked about historical significance. Weber's response was immediate. The cold was absolute. It was like hell, except hell is supposed to be hot. Our hell was frozen. 20,000 men died in one night without enemy action. That's not war. That's murder. Our leadership murdered us by refusing withdrawal. They valued symbolism over our lives. We paid for it with our bodies. The interview concluded with Weber's assessment of what Stalingrad meant. We can honor soldiers who suffered without honoring leadership that created their suffering. The men who froze showed courage and endurance, but their courage was wasted. We learned lessons about leadership failures, about logistics, about necessity of withdrawing when positions become untenable. My generation learned too late. Maybe yours won't have to. Weber died April 17th, 1980. 4 months after his 77th birthday. Pneumonia claimed him tuberculosis-damaged lungs, unable to fight infection. Greta was present, their relationship having improved marginally over years as she came to understand the enormity of what he had survived. His last coherent words were instructions about the memorial he had maintained for 46 years. Tell them, keep telling them, Schneider from Bremen, Kessler from Bavaria, Fischer from Dresden. 33 men in one basement, thousands more across the pocket. They died in the cold. Someone has to remember. Greta kept the list he had written, names transcribed from memory onto paper. 47 men from the basement plus hundreds from his company. She donated it to German military archives, ensuring the memorial would exist beyond her father's life. Captain Volkov had continued his military career after Stalingrad, rising to colonel by war's end, serving in Soviet occupation forces in Germany until 1949, then in various intelligence positions until retirement in 1968. He lived in Moscow, married, raised 2 children, carried his own memories of what he had witnessed at Stalingrad. In 1986, during Glasnost's early days when Soviet citizens could speak more freely about war experiences, Volkov was interviewed for a Soviet documentary about Stalingrad. He described the encirclement from Soviet perspective, the strategy of waiting while cold and hunger destroyed German combat effectiveness, the eventual assault that eliminated the pocket. But he also spoke about the freeze night, about watching through binoculars as Germans dragged thousands of bodies from positions, about interrogating the young prisoner who said everyone was dead. Some just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The interviewer asked whether Volkov felt the German suffering was justified given the invasion and atrocities committed during the advance. Volkov's answer reflected 40 years of thinking about that question. They invaded our country. They burned our villages. They killed our families. They deserve to be defeated. But watching men freeze to death, even enemy men, showed me something about the nature of suffering. They were victims of their own leaders' decisions as much as they were enemies we needed to destroy. Both things were true. That complexity doesn't excuse the invasion. It just makes the whole catastrophe more tragic. He paused, then continued. I interrogated a German soldier in 1943, Klaus Weber. He had lost his feet to frostbite. He acknowledged his guilt for participating in the invasion while being honest about his limited choices. That kind of moral clarity was rare. I told him maybe he would survive captivity and go home. I hope he did. I hope he told people what happened. Someone needed to tell the truth. The freeze night of January 8-9, 1943 remains perhaps the single worst non-combat loss of life in military history. 20,000 soldiers dying from cold exposure in 24 hours exceeds casualties at most major battles. The deaths resulted from leadership decisions that left soldiers without adequate supplies, shelter, or equipment in extreme winter conditions. Hitler's refusal to allow breakout, Göring's impossible promises about air supply, Paulus's obedience to orders he knew were killing his army. These failures extended through every level of German command. Modern military doctrine emphasizes that commanders bear responsibility for avoiding unnecessary risk, that logistics must be secured before operations begin, that symbolic objectives cannot justify catastrophic losses. Stalingrad illustrates what happens when these principles are violated. The lessons remain relevant because similar situations continue to occur in warfare where inadequate preparation or political interference creates conditions where soldiers die unnecessarily. The commemoration exists primarily in testimonies like Weber's, in memoirs and interviews collected over decades. Volgograd maintains its monuments to Soviet victory, honoring defenders who stopped German advance and reversed the war's trajectory. German memorialization is more conflicted, struggling to honor soldiers' sacrifice while acknowledging that sacrifice was wasted through leadership failures. Weber's testimony ensures the freeze night remains documented. The cold that killed 20,000 in one night was a natural phenomenon, but conditions that left soldiers vulnerable were created by human decisions. The night when 33 men froze in one basement while 15 survived stands as indictment of leadership and testament to human endurance under conditions that should never have been endured. The ruins of that basement still exist beneath Volgograd's reconstruction, foundations marking where men died in frozen darkness. No plaque identifies the location, no marker commemorates the 33, but Weber testified, and his daughter kept the list, and the archives preserve the names, and testimony persists when bodies and buildings have long since returned to dust.